Rique in 1139, it would still be several more years before he was recognized as King of Portugal by both the King of Leon in 1143 and Pope Alexander III in 1179. It also took a few more battles before the kingdom reached its present size. The Siege of Lisbon in 1147, and it finally ended with the conquering of the Algarve in 1249. After this, the Portuguese kings were stylized the King of Portugal and the Algarves, which is really interesting. Then, of course, later will be Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, but that's much later. If you've ever wondered why is Portugal so small, they would have had the opportunity to conquer more land because the Spanish still did fight for a little while longer. Excuse me, but the geographical boundaries that exist in the Portuguese side of the Iberian Peninsula is what kept them from expanding any farther. You've got the mountains up in the north and Trás-os-Montes, and then you have the rivers down in the south. So that kind of just sort of left them where they're at. But as I mentioned before, this was actually very beneficial to Portugal because being small meant that it was easier for the king to control the country. And of course, that is what led the Portuguese to be able to go out on their explorations while everybody else is still fighting. So now, there are four categories of important royal women in Western European courts during the medieval and early modern periods: the princess, the queen consort, the queen regent, and the dowager queen. In some cases, there were also regnant queens or queens who ruled in their own right, but this was extremely rare in Portugal. For today's purposes, I'm going to focus on the queen consort and the queen regent. The study of queenship in Portugal is still a relatively new one. In fact, it wasn't until 2006 that we even had a biography for every queen in Portugal. Actually, there's some that they lumped through for queens together, but that's something else. But anyway, until the last couple decades, historians rarely gave queens more than a cursory glance. Despite the fact that queens were in fact extremely important in their own times, they were the patrons of the arts and the church. They often held vast estates with vassals and other retainers. Yet historians always seem to put the king firmly at the center of the story, relegating his queen or queens as passive observers, there to make marriage alliances and give birth to future queens. Of course, it is not totally the fault of these former historians that this occurred, as the medieval world was a man's world. Many times they did not even bother to record the year of a woman's birth or discuss their childhoods in any detail. In addition, here in the United States, we inherited the English common law tradition, which made women nothing more than an extension of her husband. English women did not have property rights or any rights not afforded by a husband or father, unless she was a widow. In France, they even had a law called the Salic Law, which prevented women from inheriting the throne at all. But on the Iberian Peninsula, things were much different for women. For instance, unlike England, where a woman's inheritance would go directly to her husband's ownership, an Iberian woman would retain full rights to her own inheritance or dowry lands, and she could sue a husband who mismanaged them. As I mentioned previously, the study of Portuguese queenship is still a relatively new field. There are many historians, such as Rita Costa Gomes, Ana Maria Rodrigues, and Maria Paula Lourenço, who have been delving into the particulars of Portuguese queens, their patrimonies, and their place within the court. But as of yet, there has not been a comprehensive study on the power of the Portuguese queen and her role as a vessel of power in relationship to the king. Therefore, we must turn to historians like Teresa Ehrenfeit, who has written several volumes on the subject within the Spanish kingdoms. Even though there are ways in which the Portuguese are uniquely distinct from their Spanish neighbors, Portugal does share a historical and cultural history with its neighboring kingdoms, as much as we hate to admit it, but it's true, as they all survived the invasions of the Visigoths, Romans, and the Moors. Looking at the other Iberian kingdoms is warranted, as we can see similarities in the development of the monarchy in general, and more specifically queenship. This is especially important because so many of the Portuguese queen consorts from 1147 to 1580 were of Spanish birth. The queens were raised in the monarchical traditions of their homelands, and it is then probable that these women would come to Portugal with these ideas firmly entrenched in their psyches. According to Teresa Ehrenfeit, Spanish monarchy developed from two main influences: the Visigothic tradition of cooperative monarchy and the struggles of the Reconquista. The Visigoths saw monarchy as a partnership between king and queen, rather than something that belonged exclusively to the king. The ensuing Reconquista reinforced the monarchy as a pragmatic partnership between king and queen. Marriage alliances required delicate maneuvers, as local traditions and customs were something that needed to be adhered to, and many times it required the cooperation of the queen to make this work. I don't want to give you the sense that the king and queen enjoyed an equal partnership. The queen's role was more of that of a junior partner. However, it does not make her role in the monarchy and her power any less because of the status. The monarchy has been traditionally viewed as a simple hierarchical system in which the king is the top and everyone else falls into their place underneath. This view is reinforced by the ideas of the time, especially what was known as the Great Chain of Being. Now, this categorized people, animals, and even celestial beings into their proper place on the hierarchy, much like the links on a chain or a ladder, if you will. So of course, back then, the idea that all men are created equal or that anyone is equal if you're not in the same class would have been ridiculous. They would have laughed at you. In reality, things were actually much more different. The monarchy was more of a cooperative institution, not only between kings and queens, but with the nobles as well. Even though the early modern age saw the beginnings of the divine right theory, which placed the king firmly in the center of power, as he was destined by God to sit on the throne, he was not able to retain that power without the cooperation of the nobles and at times even the queen. The king's power was a delicate balance that had to be maintained, or he risked losing the throne. In Portugal, we will see that throughout the medieval and early modern periods, which is again 1100 to 1800, more or less, the kings actually relied on the queen, both personally and as an institution, to help maintain and increase their power. The problem with queenship is that it is not as straightforward as the power of the king. Now, when I mean queenship, I'm speaking solely about the woman's role as a queen, a consort to her husband. Of course, queenship, as far as sitting on the throne, like Elizabeth I of England, is more related to kingship, even though she's a woman. The king's power was relying on inheritance and the cooperation of the nobles and people. The queen's power was not straightforward because it relied on her relationship with her husband and children. Her power was derived from these relationships, and her circumstances could change at any moment, depending on the political atmosphere. Despite this, the queen's power is not any less important than the king's, especially in Portugal, where we see the queen act as the king's partner. Portuguese queens shared similar roles to their northern neighbors in the fact that their main duty was to produce healthy heirs for the kingdom and see to their educations. As perpetuators of the family line, it was a woman's job to ensure that there befell neither physical nor moral harm to the fetus. The queen was entrusted with the future of the dynasty and the kingdom, and this is a very serious and important role. In addition, of all the nobles of court, the queen enjoyed intimate knowledge of the king's body, which carried its own responsibilities. This is where many of the similarities end. While queens in other countries could also be seen as helpmates of the king concerning his power, women in the Iberian kingdoms were more likely to exercise power in their role as queen. As I mentioned before, the idea of a regnant queen was not repugnant to the Portuguese. When Fernando I died in 1383, his daughter Beatriz could have very easily retained her role as a reigning monarch had other events not occurred. The people did not reject her as queen because she was a woman, but rather because they despised her mother, Leonor Delge, who was acting as regent because Beatriz was living in Castile with her husband, Juan I. Another example is the Princess Joanna, more commonly known as Saint Joanna, although she's only been beatified and she's not actually been canonized. This happens a lot, especially in the medieval period. People would just start saying, hey, you're a saint, and then everybody called them a saint, and that was it. She was the daughter of Alfonso V, and she was second in line to the throne behind her younger brother, João, the future João II. She did not have any political ambitions whatsoever, and instead she was determined to enter the convent, which she did. The populace objected to this as they saw her proper place as being in court. Even though she was no longer the heir presumptive, and as she had been for the first 3 years of her life, the people still wanted to ensure that she would be eligible to take the throne as queen and marry should the need arise. At one point, people even rioted outside the convent in Evade to protest her presence there. She hadn't taken orders yet, but they feared she would. Despite the fact that she received several marriage offers, she refused them all and stayed in the convent instead. However, she did leave the convent several times to serve as regent for her father and brother when they left the kingdom. To contrast this with England, Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, was his only legitimate child at the time of his death in 1135, and yet the French-influenced court would not accept her as queen, even though she had already given birth to a son. The country fell into civil war as Matilda fought for her rights to sit on the throne against her cousin Stephen of Blois, who ironically was the son of Henry's sister, Adela. So in this ironic meaning, because of course, she's descended from a woman, but he's still a man. She herself led the rebellion for many years while Stephen sat on the throne, and eventually Henry assumed the throne upon Stephen's death, even though Matilda was still alive. The contrast here is apparent. The English were willing to overlook the claim of a daughter to her father's throne in favor of a nephew because he was a man, while the Portuguese would have accepted the ascension of Joanna to the throne had João been unable to himself. Now, another historian, Ana Maria Rodrigues, suggests that the queen consort role in Portugal had many similar functions to the same role in other countries. The first way was to create alliances. The most common way was an alliance between kingdoms. Portugal saw 18 queen consorts from 1146 to 1580. Of the 18, 12 were from the Spanish kingdoms, with the exception of Dona Messia Lopes de Haro. All of them were from either Castile or Aragon. 3 Portuguese ladies, 1 English, and 1 from Savoy. Part of the reason for this tactic was the settlement of the alliances between countries. Fernando I was supposed to marry the daughter of Enrique I of Castile, Leonor, but he reneged on the deal when he met and fell in love with another Leonor Teles, the devil woman, and he married her instead. This ended the alliance the two had signed, and this was part of the reason Fernando went on to support Enrique's rival, John of Gaunt. However, the number of Spanish matches was also part of a misguided effort on the part of the Portuguese monarchy to become the masters of the Iberian Peninsula by producing Portuguese heirs to the Castilian and Aragonese thrones. So when you say I'm a lover, I'm not a fighter, that's the Portuguese. You know, the Castilians wanted to fight, they wanted to be lovers and just marry everybody. And it also exemplifies Rodriguez's second point, which was the usefulness of the queen consort in regards to dynasty. Don Alfonso V married his niece Juana la Beltraneja after her niece Isabel of Castile took her throne. And yes, this is the Isabella la Católica. She wasn't as saintly as everybody would like to think. In fact, so she was Juana was the daughter of Isabel's brother Enrique, and when Enrique died, Juana should have ascended to the throne, and Isabel instead married her cousin Fernando of Aragon and stole the throne from her niece. And the La Beltraneja name is an implication that Juana was the daughter of Juan Beltran. So she's trying to imply that she's illegitimate and therefore could not ascend to the throne. So she goes and marries Alfonso V, and Alfonso is hoping that he's going to become king of Castile through the claim of his wife. But after some skirmishes, nothing ever came of it, and Juana was just disgusted with Alfonso, and she ended up retiring to a convent. This method of marrying Castilian princesses backfired in 1580 when Philip II of Spain took claim of the Portuguese throne after the deaths of Don Sebastião and the Cardinal Henrique. So Philip's mother was Portuguese, and even though he technically did not have the best claim, he did have the biggest army and the most money, and so, ta-da, he became King of Portugal. And so this was, and of course, again, this is all due to the fact that so many Portuguese kings had married into the Castilian royal families and back and forth that it gave Philip a very strong claim to the throne. In fact, he was the uncle of Sebastián. The Portuguese monarchs definitely learned their lesson after this episode. Once the Portuguese were restored to their independence in 1640, only 3 of the next 13 queen/king consorts, because we will have 2, Dona Maria I and Dona Maria II, were of Spanish birth. And I'm not counting Dona Luisa Guzmán because she was already married to Don Juan when he took the throne. Now, earlier I mentioned that kings had to maneuver through complicated political minefields. This was also true for their wives, although their minefields existed more at court and with the people themselves. Women of noble birth were often treated like pawns in the game of chess that made up European politics, and they normally did not have a say over whom they married. There were a few exceptions, though, namely Princess Joanna, again, whom I mentioned before. She received several offers of marriage, all of which she refused. Most famous was the marriage proposal she received from King Richard III of England in 1485. According to legend, she refused to marry him based on a prophetic dream she had, which foretold his demise at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August. So, you know, supposedly she said that I had a dream that he died, I'm not going to marry him, and then he did die. So she got lucky there. I guess she didn't marry him. But it definitely shows that, you know, we can't think that women in this period did not have any agency and that they could not stand up for themselves. There definitely were instances where women could have power over their own lives. In general, queen consorts had to work to prove their loyalty to the king and kingdom. A foreigner had barriers such as language and custom to overcome. A lot of times they had to work extra hard to prove that they no longer held ties with their homeland and that their sentiments were firmly in the Portuguese kingdom. Even those queens who were Portuguese were often met with suspicion. Because the political climate at court was very delicate, the slightest thing could disrupt the ecosystem and turn things upside down. The daughter of a Portuguese nobleman could very well be in a position to reward and promote her own family members over the other noble families, and they often did. I always think of them kind of like children, like, you know, that's not fair, she got this and I don't get this, but, you know, I guess that's their problem. But the presumption that the king could potentially be under the influence of one particular family was not a good situation for the others. So an example of this can be seen with Leonor Teles, again, the wife of Don Fernando I. As a descendant of 2 important noble families in the kingdom, she brought anger and jealousy upon herself by arranging marriages for her kinswomen and allocating important positions and lands to her family members and friends. According to Fernão Lopes, who wrote Chronicle of Fernando, she was also despised because of her perceived influence over the king. Lopes stated that the king acted as though he were under a spell. Now, I want to stop here for a second just to make a point that when we read medieval chronicles, especially when it comes to women, we have to kind of read them with a grain of salt. You know, Lopes was writing these chronicles during the time of Don Duarte. Don Duarte was the I guess, great nephew of Fernando. And, Lopes definitely has an agenda. He wants to make João the first, who came after Fernando and who took the throne from Beatriz. Wanted to make him look as though, we definitely had to come in because Leonor was so bad. She was a harlot and she was sleeping around. And we don't even think Beatriz was legitimate because we know Fernando was too sick and everybody knew that they weren't even sleeping together anymore. And remember, back then, nobody had privacy. So if you weren't sleeping together, the whole court knew. So Lopes has an agenda to make Leonor look really bad. And so we don't know, obviously. We do know that there was some anger against her, but I don't know if she slept around or anything like that. Sometimes I wish I had a time machine. Okay, so one of the key features of Portuguese queenship was the Casa das Rainhas, or the Queen's household. Now, this entity describes the series of lands that belonged to the Queen consort upon her marriage to the Portuguese king. This is really, really unique. You don't really see this much. Now, it was usual practice for the Queen's parents to give her a dowry. In northern kingdoms, such as France and England, for instance, the dowry became the property of the husband as a sort of payment for his bride. In the Iberian Peninsula, the dowry remained the property of the Queen. She was able to collect rents and have other powers in these lands, and many relied on them for income upon reaching widowhood. What made Portugal unique is that the Queen consort obtained these lands upon her marriage and kept at least some of them until after death. So in the beginning, we see where these queens are kind of here and there getting lands, and then it becomes more of an institution as time goes on. But having these lands definitely guaranteed the Queen's autonomy from her husband, meaning that she didn't have to rely on him for money. She didn't have to ask him for money to pay her servants or to, buy clothes or to patronize the arts or to give money to the church. If we look at, for example, Catherine of Aragon, when she married Arthur, before she married Henry, when Arthur died, Henry VII didn't want to give her back to her father, Fernando, because he didn't want to give the money back, because he was a cheapskate. So he held on to Catherine, kind of hinting that he might marry her to Henry, but he really had no intention of doing so. And he actually thought about marrying himself. But what happened was he didn't want to spend money on Catherine either. And Fernando was like, hey, I washed my hands of you. You're not my problem anymore. So the poor thing was like in rags, had no money to pay her servants. She had nothing. Had she been Portuguese or a Portuguese queen, then at the time of Arthur's death, then half of those lands she would have retained and she would have had her own income. So she wouldn't have had to rely on Henry, begging him for money to even eat sometimes. So it's really a very big difference between the two. And of course, that they're able, after the death of their husband, as I was mentioning, now they can lead an independent life. Although many queens would retire to a convent, they didn't have to do that. And if they lived in a convent, many of them didn't actually take orders. They just kind of lived there and they had the money to support themselves. Now, the Casa das Rainhas began as a more informal donation of land from the king to his bride with some of the earlier queens and became more institutionalized in the 14th century during the reign of Don João I, who reigned from 1385 to 1433. He donated certain lands to his English wife, Dona Felipa de Lancaster, the daughter of John of Gaunt, who was a Duke of Lancaster from England. During the reign of João II, 1481 to 1495, in addition to the previous patrimony, he added the villages of Aldeia Galega, Aldeia Gavinha, and as well as the cities of Silvas and Faro in the Algarve. His queen, Queen Leonor, founded a hospital in a remote area that contained a natural source of hot springs, a place that later would become the town of Caldas da Rainha. During the reign of Dom João III, who reigned from 1521 to 1557, the queen gained even more control over her lands. King João entitled his wife Dona Catarina with the powers of appointing the notary public, the local military governor, the alcaide mor, with the benefit of a share of their revenues and the church patronage, as well as the civil and criminal jurisdictions of the queen's lands, with the exception of the crown's jurisdiction. Another letter made the queens exempt from royal jurisdiction. This meant that not even royal ministers could step foot on the queen's lands without her prior consent. So can you imagine, here the king is like the ultimate, supreme ruler, because he would like to think, and he has to ask his wife's permission before he can send his men across her territories. Now, upon the return of the...
Monique, just a quick question, was that a very Portuguese thing in the Iberian Peninsula? Was that
yes, you really don't see
Portuguese?
That okay. Yes, yeah. Okay. And what's really interesting about it is that, it began as, in some ways, the king did use the lands as sort of an alternative to, give rewards to nobles. So it's not all from him, but it's also using the queen's lands as well. But yes, I don't know of anywhere else where the queen had so much autonomy and so much power.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's no problem. No problem.
I'll leave my questions to the end.
Okay. So now from 1580 to 1640, the Casa dos Rainhas did not belong to the queen consorts, because we have the Philip II, who was Philip I of Portugal, Philip II, the three Philips, and they did not grant their wives the Casa dos Rainhas from Portugal. Instead, the Casa dos Rainhas actually went to some of their male vassals. So it's not until 1640, when Don Juan IV and the independence, when they kick out the Spanish, that Juan IV actually reestablishes the Casa dos Rainhas with the intention, and to quote him, that the queen be able to govern her ministers and be sustained with the rents in a way that had been done by the queens of his kingdom, her predecessors. So the reestablishment of the Casa dos Rainhas was necessary for economic reasons. The money garnered from the rents of the lands were used for the personal use of Bragança family and house, leaving the treasury for military and defense in the war against Spain. Now, the queens received all of the rents and incomes that came with those lands. They were even allowed to collect taxes, as evidence from several documents that show townspeople complaining to the king about the heavy taxation from the queen. I always imagine myself, the king's thinking, what do you want me to do about it? I can't. In addition, the queens also had a lot of power in these lands. In some cases, they were allowed to pick the governors and judges of these lands, although in a lot of cases, they ended up picking the king's officials anyway. In 1375, Don Fernando I, he was really, even though he wasn't the first one to establish the Casa dos Rainhas or, be the first one to give lands to his wife, he is the one that really started giving a lot of lands to the queen. And one of the big reasons what he said was, Dona Leonor, this was already her second marriage. And so her parents couldn't give her another dowry. So she came to marriage with the king, which actually she was still married, by the way. He had her marriage annulled. But when he married her, she didn't have a dowry. So he argued that he had to give her more lands so that would make up for the fact that she didn't have a dowry. But we really see that Fernando was actually trying to take power away from the nobles. As I mentioned, the nobles were really always, trying to get more power, always kind of vying for power, especially with the king. And so one way that Fernando was able to keep control over the lands was to give them to his wife. And so and if you're wondering, well, why didn't he just take it himself? He's the king. Well, if you start land grabbing, then it makes the other nobles nervous, and they might join up their armies together and revolt against the king. So you don't want that. You have to be, it's like a chess match. You have to be very careful, you have to be diplomatic, and you have to be balanced. So if he's instead is saying, I'm giving it to the queen, and by the way, this queen has no control, like I don't have any control over her, like this is hers. So she's a noble in her own right in a lot of ways. Then it kind of keeps everybody happy, because they're like, okay, so the king isn't trying to take away all of our land and take away all of our power. He just has to give it to his wife so that she can have an income for herself. They still didn't like her, but they dealt with it. Now, I'm sorry, I missed. So what happens when I ad lib? All of this allowed the queens to pay for their servants and clothes, to patronize the arts, and most importantly, be generous to the poor. It also enabled them to be able to influence choices for the church officials, since they were such big benefactors to the church. So even though technically the Pope was supposed to be the person who was in charge of appointing bishops and cardinals and things like that, the king tried to have influence, and this was a point of contention in the medieval period between the monarchs and the Pope. But the queens of Portugal actually had a lot of influence on the appointing of different church officials because of the fact that they gave so much money to the church. And also, I was mentioning the patronage of the arts. One big example of this is Dona Leonor, who was the wife of Don Juan II. She actually was the one who started the career of Gil Vicente, who was one of the most prolific medieval playwrights in Portugal. He actually started as her goldsmith, and it was because of her that he actually was able to stop working and start writing plays. So it's thanks to her that we even have his plays around. Now, these lands enabled the queens to do a lot of good for the Portuguese. For example, it is probable that Dona Isabel would not have been able to give to so many people without Indonesia's knowledge, had she not had the income from her lands. So, we've all heard the story of the roses, how Dona Isabel was carrying bread to give to the poor, and Indonesia said, "What do you have there?" And she said, "I'm just carrying some roses." And he said, "Well, let me see." And when she turned around, God made a miracle, and now she's got roses. Um, of course, if you're not religious, you may not. It's a story to represent the giving spirit of Dona Isabel, but she had her own power to give, and she didn't have to ask the niche for money in order to be charitable. She also built the Mosteiro de Santa Clara in Coimbra, where she built the old one, Santa Clara Velha, and then they later had to build Santa Clara Nova in the 17th century because the floods, where it was built, is too low. She's buried there today, but she's actually the one that helped fund that, and she designed it and paid for her own tomb. So she was kind of a dabbler in architecture as well. But it also, besides giving them the opportunity to give and do good for the world, it also gave the queens a lot of power, as you can imagine. One big example, if we go back to Dona Isabel, is the rebellion of her son Afonso against her husband Dom Dinis. Now, Afonso was jealous of his half brother, also Afonso, who was illegitimate, but was just the golden child. According to Dinis, loved Afonso, and there was actually some fear that he might overlook the legitimate Afonso in order for the illegitimate Afonso to take the throne after him. So Afonso rebelled, and during that time, he's running from his father, and he actually went and hid on the queen's lands. So here he is in the queen's lands, and Dom Dinis could not follow him to go capture him. So as soon as he got to the border, "You can't pass," the queen says you can't. So that really shows the power that the queens could have wielded with the land. Of course, Dom Dinis got really mad at Isabel and took away her lands as a result. So he said, "Fine, you're going to be like this, then I'm just going to take them away from you." But it's very brave of her to stand up to her husband like that. And she was, of course, very responsible for brokering the peace between Dom Afonso and Dom Dinis. Now, according to legend, she prayed to the Holy Spirit and said, "If you can help bring peace between my husband and my son, then we will have a big feast and we're going to feed the poor." And that's supposedly where the flesh of the Holy Spirit comes from, is that she has a big feast and she fed everyone who came who wanted to eat, and she placed her crown on the head of the poorest person she could find and sat them in her throne as a thank you to the Holy Spirit for helping and bringing peace to Portugal. Of course, there's also the side of people who think that Dona Isabel, she's from Aragon, might have been confused with her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, who also had a feast, who also did feasts in honor of the Holy Spirit. Just to let you know. Okay, so being the queen consort definitely had its challenges. But in Portugal, it also had its benefits. So the queen consort wasn't tied down. She had a lot of her own autonomy. She had her own money, and so she was also able to make a lot of trouble. But but it wasn't what you might think being a queen was, whereas being oppressed or being downtrodden. Now, to be a queen regent, that's a whole different story. And now the perfect quote that I found that kind of represents what it means to be the queen regent can be found again from Teresa Ehrenfeit. And she says, "Queenship encompassed a spectrum of ruling practices bounded by two extremes: a queen ruling in her own right, and outright prohibition of female rulership." Being a queen regent was very common thing, especially in Portugal. It was because, again, the monarchy was more of a partnership, a cooperation between the king and the queen. It was very common for the queen to be regent for her husband anytime he left the country, if he had to go to war or if he was ill, and especially if he died. Now, in the medieval period, we only have the cases of two queen regents. So it was Dona Leonor, both Dona Leonors. One, Dona Leonor Teles, and she was the queen regent for Beatriz, and that was a disaster. And then, of course, Dona Leonor, the wife of Don João, who, again, a disaster. So I really won't talk much about them because really, to me, the best representation is Dona Luisa Guzmão. She was the regent for her son, Don Alfonso VI, although she was kind of a strange case. So what happened was Don Juan IV died in 1556, and Dona Luisa was supposed to be the regent for Don Alfonso. And Don Alfonso was 13. Now, at the time, the age of majority for kings was 14. You can imagine a 14-year-old being king of the country. That is a very scary thought. But at least they didn't have video games, I guess. So, but Don Alfonso was just a few months shy of his 14th birthday. So rather than being regent for a few months and letting him ascend to the throne at 14, she actually called for him to become king early when he was 13. But she still acted as the regent for the next 6 years. So Alfonso was kind of left to go play and do whatever he does, which, is like beating up citizens and things like that in Lisbon. And Queen Dona Luisa was the one who kind of did the heavy lifting and ran the business of the kingdom. Now, in order to determine how Dona Luisa was able to manipulate the gender roles of her time, it's important to first look at what entailed the gender roles in the 17th century. According to the historian Catherine Crawford, a woman's role in the 17th century was based on a series of dependent relationships: daughter, wife, and mother. As I mentioned, it was the woman's job to ensure that there befell neither physical nor moral harm to the fetus. So in England, you saw where after Henry VII, the queen would have to go into seclusion, and then this actually became a trend where several weeks before the birth, the queen had to shut herself away, close up the room, close up all the windows. It was extremely hot. She would shut herself away with her ladies and basically just lay in bed until it was time to have the baby. And of course, that was to protect the fetus. I don't know how they didn't die of boredom, but education for girls was more informal than it was for boys. And of course, in the medieval times, the education wasn't that widespread unless you were in the church. So if we get to the early modern period, education, we got the Renaissance, and of course, being a royal, being educated is very important. Now, despite women's authoritative role in running the household, the education usually involved being educated in running of a household and preparation for being a wife. So you learn how to dance, you learn how to cross stitch, things like that. You might work with lace, so you do ladylike things. And despite the woman's authoritative role in running the household, they still remained in a dependent status in relationship to men. This was because women were most commonly regarded as being weak. For instance, their sexual weakness was the reason that women needed to have such strict rules of behavior, meaning women cannot help themselves sexually, so therefore we have to lock them away and protect them from themselves so that they don't disgrace the family. This is very opposite from the Victorian view, where it's the men that can't help themselves and they just jump on any woman that they see. So we have to protect women from men. So kind of the idea we have, sort of today, that's not what it was in the medieval and early modern periods. They actually thought, because their idea was that women's sexual organs sort of roamed around their bodies. And so they thought this is what made women so erratic and crazy and just, they can't help themselves, out of control. So let's see. This created the need for female deference within the family. Their behavior was limited to matters that would not threaten the family or something that would be in service to the family. So whenever a woman took on the role of queen regent for her minor son, it was seen as a natural extension of her motherly role. This role of mother meant that it would be expected that she would work to protect the throne and country for her son. Not only would she not work to overthrow the king, as her position depended on her son staying in power. Finally, as the regency period normally had a definitive end date, which was usually when the king turned 14, she was normally not very threatening to any ambitious nobles and family members who might fear that their positions at court might be diminished, or so you would think. So again, the court in itself for everyone was a tightrope walk, and especially for a queen regent, she was especially vulnerable. The king is no longer alive to protect her. Her son is a child. You have nobles at court, and everybody wants to have influence over the king, because if he's a child, he's easy to manipulate. And so they want to grab power for themselves. So a queen regent is actually in a very vulnerable position, because if she shows even the least bit of ambition, if she shows any kind of want or desire to take the throne for herself or to take power for herself away from the nobles, then they'll just get rid of her. And, we saw that with Catherine de' Medici. She was very maligned because she was seen as a very powerful woman who basically just ran the kingdom. And so Louisa kind of took things a different way. So as a ruler or a regent, a female was expected to represent both female and masculine gender roles. So on the one hand, she had to appear stereotypically feminine, obedient, pious, and dutiful in order to be regarded as a good person and fit to be in a position of power. And as I mentioned, Leonor was not that. So like when Philippe of Lancaster becomes queen for Don Juan I, they just go on and on about, oh, she's so pious, she's so wonderful, so much discipline at the court. We don't have this craziness like with Leonor. So that was expected of women. On the other hand, necessity required her to display stereotypically male attributes as well, bravery, wisdom, and duty to the kingdom in order to prove that she was strong and smart enough to handle the rigors of power. So again, she has to be man enough and woman enough at the same time. It's very difficult. And that's why so many women failed at it. They just, I really believe that a lot of queen regents, most of them probably, if not all, were really interested, of course, keeping their child on the throne. But they were just no match for the kind of the vultures that surrounded the throne at the time. The issue of gender aside, a regency period also caused unrest because it was a time of transformation, uncertainty, transformation and uncertainty, and produced contestation among figures at court. So therefore, a regent achieved this feeling of stability by reassuring observers with normal gender behavior to imply that their only abnormal behavior was the public exercise of authority. So, they have to basically say, look, I'm a woman, and if I wasn't, I have to be here to protect my son because that's my motherly duty, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to. But I have to be here, so I'm going to do it. But I really don't want to. And so you kind of have to keep up that charade in order to stay in power. If this is true, then a queen regent could try to hide behaviors that were normally considered unacceptable for her gender by overemphasizing the behaviors that were acceptable. After the death of Don Juan in 1556, Dona Luisa did not have the luxury of retreating into her grief. So, as I mentioned, she just had to take action, and she had to make sure the government remained stable. The biggest problem that was going on in this period was that you had these old, they call them the old, well, not the, I wouldn't call them old nobles, they weren't old, but they were older. And these were the guys that had fought with Don Juan IV in order to, in the restoration of the monarchy. But then you had a lot of younger nobles that were coming up. And so you had sort of this like friction between the two groups, because now the young guys want to get a piece of the pie, and they don't think it's fair that all of the older nobles have all of the positions, that they have all of the power, they have all of the money, and they want some too. So she's having to balance between these two factions, because if she shows too much favor to one or the other, they're going to turn against her. And so she was actually really smart in what she did. Sorry, I lost my. Okay, so what she did was she actually overplayed her gender roles as a woman. So you see time and time again, she writes, oh, I wish I didn't have to be here. This really is terrible. If I wish I could just retire to a convent like I should, like that's where a widow belongs. I don't want to be here, but I do this as duty to my country. She really, out of a lot of the regions that I've studied, she really tried her hardest. Now she was from Medina Sidonia, which was a Spanish province, the Spanish dukedom. And but she could actually speak Portuguese. Her written Portuguese was kind of so-so, was half and half, so it's a little hard to read, but she really tried her hardest. She was 19 when she came to Portugal, and she really tried her hardest to appear Portuguese, to speak Portuguese, so that she could really prove to everyone that she did have the interests of the kingdom at heart. She had to work extra hard than say a king would, obviously. And so for Dona Luisa, that was her main accomplishment as regent, was because she was able to get all the nobles to get along. So by playing this poor helpless female, she was like, I just don't even know what to do. I don't know how to rule. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And obviously I need help with Alphonse because he's kooky. So if you guys would just help me out, I would be so wonderful. I would appreciate it so much. And so she would actually form committees where both sides would be represented, and they would have to work together because they needed to help her, because she's just a poor helpless female. And I just think it's brilliant the way she kind of used the gender stereotypes against them. But the one, I mean, but Dona Luisa was definitely no shrinking flower. I'm really convinced this was all an act, because she, I don't, most people don't know that Dona Luisa is actually credited with the Don Juan taking the throne in 1640. Now, when the nobles were starting this conspiracy to try to overthrow the Spanish, they went to Joan and they said, "Hey, we want you to be at the front of this conspiracy. You would be the next one in line. You have the best claim to the throne. You need to be the king." And Joan was kind of like not very convinced, because remember, treason was punished very severely. I mean, you're drawn and quartered. I mean, you get all your lands confiscated. It's not pretty. So he is not excited to possibly put himself at the head of a conspiracy that could fail. But supposedly, Dona Luisa told him, "Antes viver reinando que morrer servir." I'm sorry, "Antes morrer reinando que viver servir." Sorry, which means I would rather die reigning than live serving. And that actually comes from, there's many sources even outside of Portugal that quote the same quote in various forms, but they all mean the same thing. So she convinced him, like, "Hey, I would rather die as a queen than live serving this king." And so she's credited with pushing Joan to actually be at the head of this conspiracy. And I also know that she ran the household with a tight fist. There was one instance where Joan had an illegitimate child. She took care of that very quickly. That little girl went to a convent, and we never heard from the mother again. And so pretty much for the rest of their marriage, we never hear of Don Juan cheating on Dona Luisa ever again. So if he did it, he kept it a big secret, which was very hard at that time. So she is definitely a strong woman, but she played the part of the weak woman in order to be able to hold on to power and to keep her son on the throne, which was very important. So in conclusion, Elizabeth I of England said it best: "I have the body of a woman, but the heart and stomach of a king." And Dona Luisa understood this very well, as did a lot of the other Portuguese queens and the consorts and regents. These women had to work within a system, and they had to work within just stereotypes, but it didn't stop them from making a difference in the country, and from still going after their goals and getting what they wanted. And again, it is all helped from the fact that the king was not her master per se, was more of her partner. Even if he was a senior partner, there's still a partnership. And it gave women a much more agency to be able to have control of their own lives and help control the lives of their children. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Fascinating as always, and entertaining as always as well. I have a couple of questions actually, and I don't know if those of you in attendance, if you have questions, I'm sure Dr. Monique Kelly-Vallance would be more than happy to tackle a few of them. Right, Monique, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, good. So one of the questions that we had actually was from the internet, from social media. And it said, "I've been reading a lot about this different time, and there's been this thought that from my readings that King Dom Dinis and Isabella de Aragon, Reina Santa, as we like to call her,
Yes.
the saintly queen, were kind of a power couple. Is that a way to interpret this question? Were they a power couple?"
I would think so.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, definitely you can see in the actions of Isabel that she knew how to make things happen. And actually, I mean, they were a power couple. Probably, I think a lot of the kings and queens together were power couples. They really worked together well to hold on to power, especially away from the nobles. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Okay. Of course, Dinis, had himself. We're not talking about Dinis. We're not talking about men in one way, but he was a revolutionary in his own time, with some of the things that he did, and for those of you who are following, who know a little bit about Portuguese history, he established the Estudos Gerais, as our historian would tell us, which is the future University of Coimbra, and I mean, it was just an important setup. It gave Portugal it gave Portugal a way forward in education, and for his time,
Yes.
that's kind of revolutionary, is it not?
Yes, yes, definitely. And he was actually, you could probably even credit Denise with the explorations as well, because he had the
Indeed.
Pinheiros of Leiria. He's was building up all these forests, and that's what allowed for the shipbuilding to commence later.
That's right. Without the Pinhal de Lidia, there wouldn't have been any caravels for sure
Right.
built. There was one question, actually. It's directed at, is your book still available? And your book is in Portuguese or English?
It's in Portuguese.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
So
So it
your
is
book.
still available. The Circulators is a little different. You can't buy, from my, I don't know, now that they've been bought out by Livre Bertrand. So you might be able to buy the book in a single form. It used to be that you had to subscribe to the series in order to get the book, but I think it's also available on Amazon as well. And if anybody out there wants a copy, you can just contact me. I have some.
And what's it called? In case
It's
people
called
ask.
Dona Luísa Guzmão, Rainha Restauradora.
Muito bem. Well, I want a copy for sure. So I'm going to
Okay.
tell you, I want to put in my name. I'm put my name in line.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I'd like to ask you is something that you commented. Well, you commented a little bit indirectly today here on the talk, and it was fascinating, and I enjoyed it, and I hope all of you enjoyed it as well out there. The lack of historical writings sometimes in Portugal. Like you said, the biographies, you mentioned this the other day on the segment in the Portuguese American Hour, how the biographies of the kings, it hasn't been too long that all the kings have biographies. I mean, there are more biographies on Henry VIII than you can, I mean, they're literally probably thousands,
Mhm.
written literally. And so, and even our most popular kings don't have hundreds of biographies written
Right.
about them as well. So, do you think that the Portuguese monarchy is understudied sometimes and
Oh,
unwritten
definitely.
about?
Oh, definitely. I mean, when I started, deciding what to write my dissertation on, my actual original idea was Catarina de Bragança, who was the daughter of Luisa Guzmão. And my advisor told me, "Oh no, she's overdone." And I was like, I think at the time there was one book written about her, and I think now there's two. So it's like she's overdone for Portuguese history. It's really it's kind of a weird phenomenon because even in Portugal, so it's not like I mean, obviously, we know that Portugal a lot of times gets ignored here in the United States and elsewhere. But within Portugal, you would think that there would be much more scholarship, Portuguese scholarship than there is, but there's not. And even if you go to the Tour de Tum, which is the archives, it's definitely not like the British Library, for instance, or even the French archives. If you go to the British Library, you practically have to like sign away your kidney just to be able to look at a book. Where in Portugal, you just show up, hey, I want to look at a book, and they give you the book. You don't even have to touch it with gloves or anything. It's just kind of crazy. And I think part of it might be just because blame it on Salazar, but it's always easy to do that. But I think that during the regime of Salazar, there was such an emphasis to try to glorify Portugal with certain figures, Don João, Don Henrique, Don Manuel, and so because of that, people focused on those kings, and then they kind of forgot about the others. And so then and I think maybe our connection, Portugal's connection with England, maybe they just kind of thought, well, our history isn't as interesting, but I find it even more interesting than some of the others. So
Yeah, and that's one of the questions also I wanted to ask you, and it's a little bit not just on the Queens, but on obviously on the Portuguese monarchy itself, because it was, I mean, Portugal from the 1100s until 1910 was a monarchy. That's a very long
right.
time, and so I preface this by saying my last year at the high school, teaching high school, my colleagues and I took a group of students on something that I didn't do much throughout the school year, which was taking students on a field trip. I mean, I've taken students to Portugal, but not something like this. That was actually Spain and Portugal. I had taken students to the Azores before. And so when and so we did a tour with one of these educational services. Actually, our good friend Duarte Silva is the one that recommended this company,
Okay.
and they were excellent. Duarte is on, and he said hello
Oh,
to
hi, Ward.
everybody. And they were excellent. And one of the things that I found was that the tour was was 7 days, if I'm not mistaken, and it was basically like 4.5 days in Spain and just 2.5 in Portugal. But the guides in Spain said everything about every single king and queen and duke and prince and princess. And in Portugal, they just went by, this is what we did. I mean, and so it seemed like, and actually, we kind of debriefed with the students later, and they found Spanish history when it came to the monarchy, and of course Spain is a monarchy again, but a constitutional monarchy. But they found it so interesting because there were all of these great stories that are true to monarchy, the love affairs, and
Right.
the passion, and the pageantry, as you mentioned before, of the monarchies. And in Portugal, we just kind of, very nonchalant about it.
Yeah.
uh, it is such an important part of our history that I believe have just as rich of I mean, if you're looking for gossip, and if you're looking for pageantry, and if you're looking for affairs and all that kind of stuff, you have just as much, do we not, in the Portuguese history?
Oh, yes, we
Kelly,
do.
Monique? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Yeah.
totally do. I mean, I was shocked when I started studying Portuguese history, all of the things that I learned because, I we really don't have very much contact with Portuguese history in our regular everyday lives. So when I went to graduate school and I started reading all of this stuff, I said, "Oh my gosh, this is great. This is amazing and interesting." I think even to the Portuguese government, they try. I've seen that they try to finance different things. Like I know when I was in high school, the they actually had an exhibit of Baroque art at the National Gallery of Art in DC, and so the Portuguese government helped finance a group of us to
Hmm.
go from San Jose
Yeah,
to go
I
to
remember that. I
DC.
remember that. Yes,
Do
yes.
you?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I was actually thanks to my madrina that I got to go, but uh, the what was interesting when you go to Portugal, I was shocked by the state of some of the monuments there, how dirty they are. I went to São Vicente de Fora, which is a church just outside of Lisbon, and that's where the Mona Lisa is buried. And there was graffiti on the church. I about had a heart attack. I was going to find somebody to kill. So it just was amazing that they just like don't seem to care. It's just kind of like here it is, and maybe that sort of has an influence on everybody else where it's like, well, they don't care, we don't care, and it's there. We don't really have much to be proud of,
Yeah,
except the explorations.
indeed.
Everybody else focuses on that. So
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, we were focused on the age of exploration, and that was a very important part, obviously, and you're the historian, but you obviously it was a very important part of our history.
mhm,
But there was a part time before, and it was a time after,
right.
and there were lots of intriguing things, and hopefully you can come back and we can do another lecture next semester and focus on maybe something else, maybe focus on some of those bad boys of the monarchy, but
Oh, I
that
definitely want to the bad boys.
focus on people, that we've heard about, but not with the detail that sometimes, and sometimes you have given us. And those of you on the audience, I would invite you to tune in every, it depends, either Wednesday or Thursday, but every week, Sundays, some weeks on Wednesday, some weeks on Thursday. And we have the history segment that Monique puts together. That's on the Portuguese American Hour. That's put forth by PBBI. And when I mean the bad boys, of course, the famous man who rebuilt Lisbon that we talked about here just a few weeks ago, in the Portuguese American Hour, who everybody hates, but everybody kind of gives him a pat on the back for reconstructing the city as the way it was. So Marquês de Pombal, who was a very very famous figure. And so I hopefully you can come back, Monique, because we'd like to do a little bit more of this. I have a couple of other comments I'd like to share with you. I think it's more comments than questions, but one of them, of course, is from our good friend Duarte Silva that we just mentioned. I should say, Professor Duarte Silva. Um, a professor emeritus from professors emeritus to me always look older, and Duarte looks like he's 35.
I know, right?
Yeah, he
You
shouldn't be
can't be a 30-year-old.
professor emeritus. Okay,
Right?
we
No,
cannot call him professor emeritus.
no.
That doesn't do any good for anybody still in academia. But it says listening to Monique begs the question: how did the academy ever let you go? You are so needed there to highlight the history of Portugal, and I agree, in our colleges and our universities that are so lacking in this important academic area. Will you come back? That's, that's
Well, you know, that's
and
part of
he adds a please, and he adds a please.
right. You know, part of the problem though is that I'm an early modernist, which that's not really in fashion right now. Most universities want modern Europe or medieval, and Portuguese history is not something that universities wanted. So unfortunately, I killed my career by studying Portuguese history, but I don't regret it one minute.
No, and he shouldn't. And actually, at one time here, we were Fresno. I think we will get to a time that Fresno State will have a historian, we need a historian in Portuguese. So think about it. I mean, you're in a different world, but it's wonderful that you continue. And one other question was, oh, Monique, teach me more. Where do I sign up? I love your pieces on Facebook. That's from Angela Brito Baldwin, the famous
Hi,
fadista,
Angela, thanks.
our good friend and wonderful fadista. And she says I can listen to you every week. And but we do want to continue because, as I mentioned before, those of you following us, Monique brings history alive, and that's what's important. She gives us these tidbits that we may think are tidbits, but that's what makes history. It's like any other discipline. It's like literature. It's like a good scientist, etc. When they're explaining something and they can bring it to your world, I think it's a lot more important. Thank you so much for Professor George Perry, who just put on, this is wonderful. Please do more. We will. If Monique is up for it.
Oh, definitely. I love it. It's so much
Okay.
fun.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. And there's one other question, which is, what books would you recommend? And we just talked about that in a way for people wanting to know a little bit more about the Portuguese monarchy or the Portuguese queens. I don't see a lot of things out there.
No, there's really
Monique's book, yes, but I mean,
right.
you have to read Portuguese, so that's the other
Right.
thing. I don't know if there's a lot of them translated to English. Even there's some good books that you mentioned. Some of the historians you mentioned that have written in Portugal, but I don't know if they're translated to English. That's
Yeah,
something
there's
that,
really not a whole lot in English. If for more of a general text, you can look there. Oliveira Marques, Antonio Oliveira Marques. He's like the godfather of Portuguese history, and he has a 2-volume history of Portugal. There's a newer volume by a guy named Disney who did a history of Portugal. It's also in 2 volumes. It's a little different than it's not really a general. It is a general overview, but not really. It does have a little bit more specifics in there. As far as like the monarchy, though, really in English, there's not much. My advisor was Francis Dutra, and he did most of his work on like the military orders and the Inquisition. But I really, Rita Costa Gomes, she's another one.
yes,
She's
Rita
fantastic.
Costa
She's
Holmes,
there
yes,
in Maryland, and she does a
excellent.
lot of work on the Portuguese medieval court. So yeah, I got to meet her at a few. I've met her at conferences before, and those Portuguese people are hilarious. One time we were at a conference in Florida, and they ran out of coffee, and I thought they were going to start a riot. So they were outside smoking, like I need my coffee. We couldn't start the talks until we got the coffee. So, but they're really nice. But yeah, and there are some translated into English. I mentioned Ana Maria Rodrigues. She has a few of her works translated into English, as well as Maria Paula Lorenz. So there's a few out there if you look hard enough, but it's very little. And even in Portuguese, there's not that much as well. So that's kind of why it's so scarce in English.
Indeed. And actually, for those of you who follow us and follow our Facebook and our social media that the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute has, between Monique and I, we, in our spare time, in the next few weeks or so, we can come up with a list and maybe, put it out as a bibliography for your concern. And I know a few of them as well, but there isn't a lot. And there was another question there on that. There isn't a lot in English. Unfortunately, there hasn't been. I mean, there's like the concise history of Portugal. There's some overall, kind of a survey of the Portuguese history that's been translated to English. But, something specific on the queens or something, the biography, even the biography of the famous ones, there's not a lot of them in English.
Right.
Yeah.
Darlene Abreu was another one I was thinking of. Actually, there's the Luso Historical Review and the Portuguese Studies Review. So those are journals. And those are a little bit more specific, but they're not like a book. David Tangwall actually wrote a book in English on the Portuguese Restoration. So he was actually He was my advisor's first graduate student, and I was the last one. So we sort of bookended
Well,
Portuguese department. So
Francis Dutra was
yes,
a great historian, and really did a lot of good work for everything that's Portuguese. Is
yes, and very, very,
fascinating.
very sweet.
I had the good opportunity of meeting him and seeing him a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, one other last thing is that the people were saying about okay, thank you for the bibliography, and qual é o livro de Monique? Well, again, o nome, your title of your book again, Monique, so people first person.
Dona Luísa de Guzmão, Rainha Restauradora.
Okay, so that's the title right there. Monique can bring her knowledge to many different courses. Yeah, gender discourse, indeed. That's from our good friend, Professor Renato Alvim, who is professor of Portuguese at CSU Stanislaus. And yeah, indeed. And so we hope to have Monique back. And thank you all for attending as well. There is a lot of things to be done with Portuguese history. Hopefully we can partner up with Monique on some things, in her free time from her career and her business. But she has the knowledge, so it's just a matter of getting some things together. And I think that we can certainly do that. And then one more thing to let you know, all of you, and that is that we'll work on getting that bibliography for you. Just some suggestions on some readings if you want to, but there isn't a lot. There are, as Monique mentioned, there are a lot of not a lot, but a few journals. Brown University has a journal that they put out. I believe it's once a year, and it's online, and it's free of charge, and it's on Portuguese history. And there's, of course, some text there in Portuguese and some text in English. Okay, a lot more in Portuguese than in English, but it's a good source as well. However, as far as books, it's a little bit more complicated.
And right now, the JSTOR, which is the article database, they're actually offering, because of the pandemic, they're allowing people to read up to 100 articles a month for free. So if you're just have an interest in history, and it can be a little intimidating to do a search in there, but you can. There's definitely a lot out there. So. And if anyone is interested, has interest in a topic that they'd like to know more about, feel free to contact me, and we'd be happy to work on something.
Sure, that's a very good idea, actually. So we hope to have Monique back with this kind of a forum on in the spring semester, and hopefully by the let me just write this. Someone asked for the title of the book is Dona Luísa de Guzmão, Rainha Restauradora, right?
Mhm.
So here we go. Okay. So we will bring of course, Monique back if she's willing. And she said yes, in the springtime, and hopefully in the fall time, we will be able to do it with Monique present, because we want her present at Fresno. I know it's a little bit of a drive, but it's not that far from Modesto. It's only about an hour and a half. So we'll do that as well. And again, do follow us and Monique's segments every week on the Portuguese American Hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Monique Kelly-Vallance. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks all of you for joining us, and take care. Have a great Christmas. I have my Christmas tie. I'm in the Christmas spirit, and I hope that all of you stay safe and healthy. We have some news, I understand, coming tomorrow, that things are going to be kind of closing down throughout the state. So hopefully we can all do better than we have been, and we can all stay healthy and safe, so we can all be together physically at Fresno State with Monique in the fall of 2021.
Yes.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Happy holidays.
You
Thank
too.
you. Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.